The title Gray Goo seemed to give us the answer before the episode even aired. Nanobots. Self-replicating machines. A cloud of microscopic technology spreading across the planet and consuming everything in its path. After episode 8, that explanation still worked. But there is a much bigger problem with it. The Gray Goo may describe the weapon. It may not describe the thing that actually killed the people outside the silos. And episode 8 gives us several clues that those could be two very different threats. The first clue is buried in what the Before Time storyline finally tells us about nanotechnology. Per Stenson was terrified of this technology because it could be weaponized on a scale that traditional weapons could not match. The danger wasn't simply that somebody could build a machine capable of destroying a city. The frightening part was that the machines could become part of the environment itself. That matters because of what we saw happen to Charlotte's aircraft. She wasn't hit by a missile. There wasn't a giant explosion. The aircraft entered that strange cloud. The material attached itself to the plane, and the technology began destroying the aircraft from the inside. That scene suddenly looks very different after episode 8. The cloud wasn't random atmospheric contamination. It was connected to a weaponized form of nanotechnology. And this is where the phrase Gray Goo becomes misleading. Classical Gray Goo describes self-replicating nanomachines consuming available material so they can continue reproducing. The important part is the replication. The machines are the threat because they keep making more machines. But Silo has shown us something more complicated. The technology appears to have been designed as a weapon. That distinction matters. If someone deliberately creates a nanotechnology weapon, the machines don't necessarily need to behave like the classic science fiction version of Gray Goo. They could be programmed to attack particular materials. They could spread through the air. They could remain dormant until triggered. They could even be paired with another system that determines who gets attacked. And episode 8 gives us another reason to take that possibility seriously. The people who built the silos weren't reacting to some mysterious natural disaster. They were preparing for a technological catastrophe they believed was coming. That means the silo project was designed around a specific threat. And once you look at the silo through that lens, the outside cleaning ritual becomes much stranger. For generations, everyone has been taught that the air outside is poisonous. People put on the suit, they walk outside, they clean the sensor, they collapse. The entire society has been built around that sequence. But Juliette already broke the pattern. She survived long enough to discover that the story everyone had been told was incomplete. Now Lukas and Kennedy have survived an even more important test. They went outside. Their mission brought them to Silo 17. They were attacked. And yet the episode gives us evidence that the environment itself may not have been what killed the people who previously left their silos. That changes the question. What actually happened to everyone outside? Because if the nanotechnology is the original apocalypse weapon, we need to separate two events that the show has encouraged us to connect: the destruction of the world and the deaths of people who later tried to leave the silos. Those may be related, they may even involve the same technology, but they don't necessarily happen in the same way. Look at Silo 17. Solo explains that his people didn't all die immediately when they left. The timing matters. The danger appeared to move with changing conditions outside. That has already led viewers to question whether the threat is carried by the wind, whether the nanotechnology remains in the environment, or whether something else is actively hunting people who leave. And now we have another piece of information. The drones. The attacks on Lukas and Kennedy involved gunfire and a buzzing sound. That raises a very uncomfortable possibility. The system protecting the silos may have multiple layers. There could be a contaminated environment outside. There could be surveillance. There could be automated weapons. And there could be nanotechnology. The people inside the silos may have been taught to think of all of this as one simple rule: outside is deadly. The truth could be much more specific. Outside is controlled. That would explain why the founders needed more than a physical bunker. A bunker protects people from the environment. A controlled perimeter protects the experiment. And Silo has spent 3 seasons giving us reasons to believe the people running this system care deeply about controlling what happens after someone leaves. That brings us back to the gray material. There is a theory that the gray substance we have seen could literally be the remains of people or organic matter consumed by the nanotechnology. That is possible. But I think there is another interpretation worth considering. What if the gray material isn't the remains of the victims? What if it is the nanotechnology itself? That sounds obvious because of the episode title, but the distinction becomes important when we remember how the technology behaved. The cloud around Charlotte's aircraft looked almost alive. It moved, it spread, it attached itself to the aircraft. And the damage wasn't simply the result of an explosion or impact. Something was actively interacting with the material. That is exactly the kind of behavior that would make a nanoweapon terrifying. But there is another question. Why would the people building the silos need to survive for hundreds of years if the weapon had already destroyed the world? Because the threat may not have ended when civilization collapsed. The silos could have been designed to protect humanity from an ongoing technological hazard. That would explain the obsession with keeping people underground. It would also explain why the outside has remained such a carefully controlled mystery. If the founders knew the weapon could persist, then telling people the complete truth would create an enormous problem. Eventually, someone would ask the obvious question: how do we know when it is safe? And that question is dangerous because the answer may be impossible to give. Maybe the founders didn't know. Maybe they only knew that staying underground was safer. Or maybe they knew exactly what was outside and built the entire system to make sure nobody could test it. That brings us to the most disturbing possibility. The Gray Goo may have been the original weapon. The threat killing people outside the silos may be what humanity built afterward to contain it. And those two systems could have been designed by completely different people. This is where episode 8 starts connecting the before times to the present in a much more interesting way. The people behind the Silo project were not simply trying to build shelters. They were trying to build a controlled society capable of surviving after civilization collapsed. That means they had to solve two separate problems. How do you keep people alive? And how do you keep people from destroying the system, keeping them alive? The second problem is why the pact, the algorithm, the surveillance, the cleaning ritual, and the safeguard all matter. The silos weren't built as normal shelters. They were built around the assumption that human behavior itself could become a threat. That makes the nanotechnology connection even more important. Imagine being one of the people who knows the real history. You know what happened outside. You know the technology that caused the catastrophe. You know that the world may still contain whatever remains of it. And you also know that thousands of people are eventually going to become curious enough to leave. You need a system that prevents them from doing that. The easiest solution is to make everyone believe the outside is instantly lethal. That belief doesn't have to be completely false. It only has to be incomplete. And Silo has repeatedly shown us that incomplete information is more powerful than an obvious lie. The cleaning ritual is a perfect example. Everyone inside Silo 18 has seen people die outside. So when someone is sent to clean, nobody needs to be convinced that the surface is dangerous. The ritual reinforces the belief. But Juliette exposed the weakness in that system. She survived. She returned. And suddenly the entire story had a problem. Because once one person proves the outside story isn't as simple as everyone believed, the system has to respond. That's why memory becomes so important this season. The algorithm doesn't need to physically remove Juliette. It needs to control what Juliette remembers. That is a completely different form of containment. And it may tell us something about the original purpose of the silos. The founders understood that information could be as dangerous as the nanotechnology itself. If people knew the wrong thing at the wrong time, the entire system could fail. That could explain why the silos have been isolated for so long. It could explain why relics are forbidden. It could explain why digging is forbidden. It could explain why the pact has become almost religious. And it could explain why the algorithm treats knowledge as something that has to be managed. Now go back to the Gray Goo. If the apocalypse was caused by self-replicating nanotechnology, then the most important question isn't simply what destroyed the old world. It's whether that technology can still spread. Because if it can, the silos aren't just hiding from the aftermath of the apocalypse. They're living inside a containment system. That would make the outside scenes terrifying for a completely different reason. Juliette walking across the surface wasn't necessarily proving that the world was safe. She may have only proved that she could survive in one particular location, under one particular set of conditions. Lukas surviving with a damaged suit is even more interesting. His survival could mean the air itself isn't the primary threat. It could mean the danger is localized. It could mean the threat moves. Or it could mean the system protecting the silos is responsible for more deaths than the environment. And this is where the drone theory becomes important. If automated weapons are deployed when certain people leave, then the cleaning ritual has another function. It isn't merely punishment, it is population control. The founders wouldn't need to tell people that drones were outside. They could make the deaths look like environmental exposure. A person walks out, they clean, they collapse. Everyone inside assumes the air killed them. Meanwhile, the actual mechanism could be something much more deliberate. That would make the cleaning ritual one of the most elaborate pieces of psychological conditioning in the entire show. And it would explain why the people who control the silos are so terrified of unauthorized movement between them. The moment Lukas and Kennedy reached Silo 17, the rules changed. They weren't supposed to be there. They were outside the controlled path. And suddenly they encountered a threat that didn't behave like the simple story everyone had been told. That is exactly the kind of detail Silo likes to hide in plain sight. The show wants us to ask whether the Gray Goo destroyed humanity. I think the better question is, what happened after it did? Because the people who survived had to make a decision. Do we rebuild civilization, or do we build a system that prevents civilization from ever reaching the same point again? The founders chose the second option, and that choice may be the real tragedy of Silo. The nanotechnology could have destroyed the old world, but fear of that technology may have created the world we are watching now. A society where history is edited, where memories can be manipulated, where people are monitored from birth, where leaving the community is treated as a death sentence, where the truth about the outside is more dangerous than the outside itself. That is why I don't think the Gray Goo mystery ends with nanobots cause the apocalypse. That's only the first layer. The bigger revelation is that the silos may have been built to survive a threat that humanity itself created, and then the survivors created an entirely new threat in response. Control. Episode 8 gives us a much clearer picture of the weapon behind the before times catastrophe, but it also leaves us with the question the final episodes now have to answer. Who controls the technology outside? And who decided that keeping humanity alive required controlling humanity this completely? Because if the Gray Goo was the weapon that ended the old world, the algorithm may be the system that made sure nobody ever rebuilt it. And those are two very different kinds of apocalypse. One destroys the world. The other decides what kind of world is allowed to exist afterward.